Clint Eastwood and the young reporter, a lesson in wisdom. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel gleamed with old Hollywood glamour. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of designer suits and evening gowns. The scent of aged whiskey, expensive cologne, and subtle tension hung in the air. Conversations floated like rehearsed dialogue, soft laughter, whispered deals, and the occasional fake compliment, all part of the industry's intricate dance. Tonight's event was meant to support veterans' mental health initiatives. But let's be real, half the people in that room weren't there for the cause. They were there for the cameras, the networking, the chance to rub elbows with power. That's just how Hollywood worked. And then, Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage. No grand entrance. Just him. At 94, he wasn't as fast as he used to be, but the way he carried himself? That hadn't changed. Hands in his pockets, shoulders squared, eyes sharp as ever. He didn't have to demand attention, it followed him. The murmurs in the room softened, heads turned, and even the most jaded Hollywood elite took notice. You didn't fawn over Clint Eastwood. You acknowledged him. You respected him. He made his way to the bar, nodding to old friends, shaking hands with a firm grip that still carried weight. He wasn't a man of small talk, but when he spoke, people listened. Across the room, a young journalist named Brandon Keller watched, sizing him up. Keller wasn't a household name, but in the world of political commentary, he was making waves. His brand? Tearing down old school figures, calling them outdated, irrelevant. He had built a following on social media by being fearless in his critiques of men like Eastwood. And tonight, he saw an opportunity. Clint Eastwood was a relic, a symbol of an era that, in Keller's mind, needed to be left behind. If he could corner Eastwood, get him to fumble, say something controversial, oh, the viral gold that would be. He could already see the headlines, Clint Eastwood called out and caught off guard. But Keller had no idea who he was dealing with. He adjusted his tie, grabbed his phone, already set to record, and made his way through the crowd. This wasn't a conversation he was looking for. This was an ambush. And he was about to learn a lesson the hard way. Keller moved with confidence, the kind that came from believing you were the smartest person in the room. He wasn't nervous, why would he be? He had done this before. He had taken down politicians, businessmen, even a few Hollywood veterans who weren't quick enough on their feet. This was going to be easy. Clint Eastwood stood at the bar, listening intently to a veteran telling a story. The man, graying at the temples, spoke with the quiet weight of someone who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. Eastwood nodded, his expression serious, his respect evident. That's when Keller stepped in. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice just loud enough to turn heads. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" A brief glance. A flicker of recognition. Then Eastwood turned back to the veteran. Keller didn't like that. He took a step closer, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "I'll make it quick," he added. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" There it was. The bait. The not-so-subtle jab wrapped in a question. People like you. A few guests stiffened. Someone set their drink down a little too hard. Even the bartender paused mid-pour. Eastwood finally looked at him. Keller pressed on, sensing an opening. "Because, you know," he continued, "Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, the outdated masculinity, the conservative values, a lot of people believe it's time to move forward. That guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." This was it. The moment Keller had been waiting for. The perfect setup. The camera was rolling. The audience was watching. He could already picture the headline, "Clint Eastwood stumbles over outdated views." But that headline was about to fall apart. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't the one stumbling. For a long moment, he just looked at Keller. Not angry. Not offended. Just studying him. Like a man deciding whether or not something was worth his time. Then, Eastwood sighed. Not a sigh of frustration. Not even exhaustion. Just complete and utter disinterest. He took a sip of his drink. Set it down. Finally spoke. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" The room chuckled. Low at first, then growing. Keller's jaw tightened. He forced a smile, trying to regain control. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to," he shot back. Eastwood tilted his head. "People," he repeated. "Or just you?" That hesitation, just half a second, was enough. Keller hadn't expected that. He had his script, but Eastwood wasn't playing along. The veteran actor leaned against the bar, his presence still effortless. "You think the world just moves forward because some guy with a keyboard says so?" he asked, his voice steady, deliberate. "That real change happens because somebody like you points a finger and says, 'That's old, throw it out'?" Keller opened his mouth. But Eastwood didn't give him the chance. "Let me tell you something, kid." That tone. The same one he'd used in 100 movies. The one that sent chills down spines. You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress. Not, he gestured vaguely at Keller, mimicking the young man's earlier dismissive wave, "whatever the hell this is." The laughter this time wasn't just a chuckle. It was louder. Someone clapped. Keller's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to back down. He forced a smirk, adjusting his posture like he still had control. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little tighter, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier." The air in the room shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. And it wasn't in Keller's favor. Eastwood let out a short laugh. Shaking his head. "Easier," he repeated, like it was the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. "I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier?" He let the words hang. "You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal?" Keller blinked. He hadn't been prepared for that. But Eastwood wasn't done. "I've seen guys like you before," he continued, taking another sip of his drink. "Looking for a soundbite. Hoping to make a scene. But here's the thing, you walked in here thinking I was gonna fold. That I'd get mad. Stumble over my words. Maybe even storm off. But," he shrugged, "I don't do performances on command. That's your job." This time, the laugh from the crowd wasn't just amusement. It was approval. Half the room was clapping now. Keller felt it. That creeping realization that this wasn't going the way he had planned. And it was about to get worse. Keller's confidence cracked, just a little. He fought to regain his footing, forcing a grin and straightening his posture, but it was clear he was losing ground. This wasn't the viral moment he had imagined. It was turning into something else entirely, a humiliating public defeat. He cleared his throat, grasping at anything to keep control of the situation. "All right, maybe you had some struggles," Keller said, his voice no longer the sharp, biting tone he'd used before. "But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore." Eastwood's gaze didn't flicker, not even a hint of defensiveness. He let out a short, almost disappointed chuckle. Left behind? Eastwood repeated, shaking his head. Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. Been written off more times than I can count. And yet, here I am. He paused, letting the words sink in. And here you are, talking to me at my table, at my event, using my name to try and make a headline. The room fell silent for a moment, as if processing the weight of what Eastwood had just said. Keller's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He was trapped in a web of his own making. Keller wasn't the only one who felt the shift. The guests around them exchanged glances, some in pity, others in amusement, but it was clear that Keller had lost the crowd. His attempted takedown of a Hollywood legend had backfired. Eastwood, however, remained as calm as ever, a picture of quiet authority. He took another sip of his drink, the audience's reaction not fazing him in the least. Then he leaned back in his chair and let the silence hang for a moment longer. Finally, Keller managed to speak, though his words came out less confidently than before. I just think people deserve better, he said quickly, desperately trying to salvage his argument. Better stories. Better representation. Better. Eastwood interrupted him smoothly, his tone low and knowing. So tell them one. Keller blinked, stunned. What? Tell them one, Eastwood repeated, his voice steady and unwavering. You keep saying what people don't want. So tell them what they do want. Go ahead, right now. Say something that'll matter more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of. It was a gut punch, a challenge that Keller wasn't prepared for. He stood there, frozen for a moment, as the weight of Eastwood's words hit him. The silence in the room grew heavy. The people who had been watching the exchange now waited, anticipating what Keller would do. But the thing was, Keller had nothing. His entire approach had been to tear someone down, to criticize the past, to make his name on the back of someone else's reputation. And now, standing in front of Eastwood, he was being asked to do something he wasn't capable of, to build something. Keller's mind raced, but the words didn't come. His throat constricted, his hands clenched at his sides, and he realized just how small and out of his depth he truly was in that moment. He had no answer. Eastwood watched him, his expression unreadable, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He had been here before, he had seen this kind of arrogance, this youthful overconfidence. But Eastwood wasn't angry. He wasn't even disappointed. He simply saw a man who had underestimated the wisdom that only time could give. The room had started to shift again. Conversations were picking up where they left off. A few people exchanged amused glances, but Keller's world had closed in around him. The harshest thing of all was not the laughter, the pity, or the uncomfortable stares. It was the silence, the fact that no one was rushing to his defense. He had lost the crowd. He had lost the argument. And most painfully of all, he realized he had lost himself. Keller finally broke the silence, his voice small and strained. I don't know, he trailed off, his words failing him. Eastwood didn't say anything. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that there was nothing more to be said. The moment had passed. As Keller awkwardly backed away, trying to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left, Eastwood turned back to the veteran he had been speaking to before the interruption. The conversation resumed, as if nothing had happened. Behind him, a middle-aged producer who had witnessed the exchange shook his head and chuckled. You know, he said, you didn't have to do him like that. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. I didn't do anything, he replied, his voice calm. He walked into it himself. I just didn't move it out of the way. The producer laughed, shaking his head. You'll never get credit for that. Eastwood shrugged. "They've been doing that for years," he said simply. "Doesn't change the truth." Across the room, another guest muttered to a friend, "Man, these people really think they can out-talk Clint Eastwood?" The friend chuckled. "They keep trying, though. But every time, the outcome's the same." The gala went on, the hum of conversation filling the air once again. Champagne flowed, deals were whispered over candlelit tables, and Hollywood's elite returned to their delicate dance of appearances. But for a few, the lesson lingered, the one that had played out in front of them in the most unexpected way. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about generations. It wasn't even about winning or losing. It was about wisdom versus arrogance. Clint Eastwood had seen it all. He had lived through the hard times, the rejection, the struggles, and the triumphs. He knew that the loudest voice in the room wasn't always the one with something worth saying. Brandon Keller, on the other hand, was part of a world where quick judgment and performative outrage had become the currency. He had come to the gala thinking he could tear down a legend, make a name for himself at Eastwood's expense. But he failed to realize that, in the world of real wisdom, tearing something down didn't make you important. Building something real did. As Keller slipped quietly out of the room, not even bothering with a dramatic exit, he had become just another name in a long list of people who had underestimated the old cowboy. He had thought he could rattle Clint Eastwood, but in the end, it was Keller who had been rattled. The truth remained, Clint Eastwood didn't need to prove anything. He never had. His work had spoken for itself. Time had judged him, and it had judged Keller too. The world is full of people looking for their gotcha moment, quick to criticize, quick to tear down. But the lesson Clint Eastwood had taught was simple: tearing someone down doesn't make you important. Building something real does. And in that moment, it was clear who had built something worth remembering. If you appreciated this story, hit that subscribe button. Share your thoughts in the comments, because some voices, like Eastwood's, don't fade with time. They only grow stronger.